And we're live. It is Monday, May 16th, 5:01 p.m. Eastern Time. We are not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to have Dan Byman back on the show, which is always a joy if today is for very sad reasons and to discuss something very heavy. But Ben, you wanted to do the intro for Dan.
Yeah, I want to do the introduction to Dan because over on Friday evening last week, or on the Wednesday evening, I hosted, along with my excellent wife, a book party for Dan and this book. And
It was on Monday.
It was on Monday. All right, it was a week ago. Dates are all the same. And when Dan spoke, he talked about how this movement that we've always thought of as domestic terrorism has internationalized. And, his specific example was that people are drawing inspiration from from a Norwegian assault from a few years ago and from a New Zealand manifesto. And as if to illustrate the point, over the weekend, somebody did exactly that, and specifically quoted large portions of the New Zealand manifesto and live streamed it like the New Zealand guy. So I just thought it was an illustration, an interesting illustration of some of the themes that Dan is working with in the book. And it was fresh on my mind when I read the news about Buffalo, because it is the internationalization of precisely the kind of white supremacist stuff that we used to think of as a kind of local, sort of indigenous American phenomenon. Um, uh, I suppose this guy is kind of that, but he's also taking inspiration from a lot of other things. All of which is to say that wherever you are in the world, you may think you're allowed to have fun, but you're not anymore because there are white supremacists coming to get you. And to talk about it with us is Dan Byman, author of Spreading Hate, which could not be better timed, unfortunately. Dan, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, Dan.
Thank you very much for having me back.
So we were chatting before in the pregame show, just kind of about everything that Ben just said to kind of lead into this, but also just kind of I think you had kind of a response to Ben's kind of intro. Do you see this as much as Ben does in like kind of this way of like proving your thesis, so to speak, or do you think that there are differences? What was kind of your take as this news broke on Saturday?
Unfortunately, this particular shooting seems kind of right up the middle of the alley for white supremacist violence in the last 7 or 8 years. It's against the Black community, kind of the community that suffered most in the United States from white supremacists. Yet, as Ben mentioned, the shooter is referencing, the Great Replacement, themes that come from around the world and inspired by the New Zealand attacker. He's using a method that we saw kind of first become super popular in Norway and then spread to New Zealand, which is a guy kind of declares himself to be a commando, gets really excited about guns and body armor, and goes in guns blazing, against innocent, defenseless people. So hardly a daring commando, but has a certain method that we're seeing, kind of the usual method for this community. So this one checks a lot of boxes. And Kate, as you know better than I, he also does the obligatory manifesto and tries to live stream this on Twitch. And, for bonus points, he throws in a personal diary that kind of gives us a blow by blow of his radicalization. So there are a lot of things that we've seen different white supremacist attackers do in recent years, and he seems to be hitting all the buttons.
Now, I forgot to mention in my internationalization discussion, the Great Replacement theory is originally French, right?
Yeah, and I mean, let's be clear, the idea that whites are under threat and people are seeking to water down the white race, that's a very old idea. And, it shows up in a lot of different countries in a lot of different contexts. So the Great Replacement, it gets a lot of attention, and, reasonably so. But it's not as if, when the French kind of thinker puts this forward, Renaud Camus, he is coming up with an idea that no one has ever thought of before. You can go back 30, 40, 50 years and see elements of this. And, people talking about America becoming, an evil nation of brown people and Catholics or whatever it is.
Mongrel mixing
of
pot.
the races.
Yeah. Exactly.
So one of the things that, and I've done a few interviews and some TV, and I'm unfortunately doing more, but because people want to talk about what the internet did to contribute to this. But one of the things that's really interesting to me is that so far the questions have actually not focused on the term white supremacy, Dan. A lot of the reporters who come to me are talking about this as hate speech. And this is a moment of unchecked hate speech online tipping over into the real world. And I don't know how to disambiguate or kind of add some granularity to that notion that this is not just hate speech and this is not just hateful ideas, but this is extremism fomenting online and finding community and also finding some type of martyrdom that they're able to put out there because they can live stream this thing. It's just hate speech doesn't seem the right way to characterize it. Do you agree with that? Or am I do you think I'm just trying to find a distinction?
No, not at all. I would say there are a couple of 100 questions, but I'll put out kind of two big questions. One is about the shooter, what he was up to, who he was talking to, the ideas that inspired him. And that's clearly, to me, in the white supremacist terrorism realm. And there are a number of words we can use, but hate speech doesn't remotely do justice to that. But the other is the kind of range of broader ideas that are, echoing the Great Replacement philosophy, the anti-immigrant sentiment, the kind of casual racism, the sorts of things that came up in the New York Times analysis of Tucker Carlson's show. And there we can talk about how, at times, you can call it hate speech, at times just pure racism online that isn't intended for violence can, understandably lead someone in that fringe 1% to think of himself as a hero, right? If you're saying, look, we're under attack, right? And you say it again and again and again, it's not surprising that some chucklehead is going to say, well, I'm going to fight back. And then people who have been saying we're under attack can't exactly say, oh, I never thought anyone would listen to me or respond to what I said.
Yeah, so when you look at this situation, it's not clear to me, as much as we all like to hate the social media platforms, that in this narrow instance, there's much else that any of them could have done. Can we start there? Is there a social media failure?
Kate, why don't you go ahead on this, because I know you've been.
Well, we were talking about this before. I think we have the same initial assessment, which was that your take was and I'm a little shocked because Siva, who is my favorite person, Siva Vaidyanathan, who is one of my favorite people to kind of disagree with about this, was kind of well, if you wrote, why don't the people at the platforms read what you wrote on the Christchurch shooting? Because maybe then this wouldn't have happened again. And I'm just it took them as we talked about, just a few minutes to take this down on Twitch. That's kind of an insanely fast response time. It's not really clear to me that there's also, and you talk about this in your book, that there was a rise in these types of crimes with the boom in live television and these kinds of moments. And of course we're seeing this more at scale now. But I'm really kind of sick of being well, government should do something, platforms should do something. And I'm isn't this kind of an indictment of how terrible people are to each other and the amount that, and I'm not trying to say that there shouldn't be some type of consequence or that there shouldn't be attempts to try to finesse this, but at the same, especially around gun control. But why is it that we're turning to platforms to turn off freedom, like free. I just don't get it. Like, I just don't understand. Like, if this guy's camera hadn't operated correctly, like, he would never have known.
So,
and like,
so hang on a second.
Happened.
I want to distinguish between two platform activities here that are different.
Yes.
So one is handling him trying to upload live video. Benjamin Whittis is killing people, right? And here's some video, right? I think they did a really good job with that. But the other is Benjamin Whittis is radicalizing in groups that you're hosting. And it's less, it does still feel to me like there are a lot of nether regions of the internet where you can go across all these platforms to radicalize, and they're not super picky about, what kind of groups you form on a lot of these sites. Is that right? Or have they made real progress in this space?
No, you raise a really good point. And actually, I want to kind of kick this to Dan, because I'm curious what his impulse is as to how much this is becoming real world violence because people have an outlet to project it and to create an entire moment for it and to memorialize it and become these insane kind of martyrs, and how much of it is the finding each other, becoming radicalized and moving towards extremism.
So I could take the cheap answer and say both. But to go to Ben's broad point initially, yeah, there are lots of pockets where we're seeing lots of people be nasty and kind of go back and forth and become nastier. And sometimes it's Facebook groups, right? Sometimes it's not the kind of chans of the world that are the little cesspools, but it's these big platforms. There's a lot on YouTube that's quite disturbing, right? There are major platforms that certainly could do significantly better on this. But then I do think, the analog often uses school shootings, where we've had school shootings, unfortunately, in the United States for many years. But Columbine kind of changed what a school shooting was. If you say there's been a school shooting, we can kind of close our eyes and imagine it, and it's probably going to look something like Columbine in many ways. And what has happened with the internet is we have, we can call it a meme if we want, but we have some sort of model for action that people are embracing. And from it, they get kind of self-worth, and they get an audience that's going to admire them just as it admired people before. But to go to Kate's point, the internet brings people together, right? And it brings people together to discuss knitting and to discuss Joe Biden's performance and to discuss how horrible the following minority groups are, right? And all those things are the same in a way. But it used to be that, for racists to kind of even read propaganda was often quite difficult. I had to find some newsletter that, someone on the fringe had distributed around his or her neighborhood. Now it's pretty darn easy, unfortunately.
Well, I just want to say to all the people out there who are considering doing a school shooting, you're not going to be famous. I
don't actually know the name of the man in Buffalo.
You're actually going to be a chump. It's been done. Think of something new. Dylan Klebold.
Ben.
No, seriously, Kate. Name me, after Dylan Klebold and what's his name at Columbine, a single school shooter.
No, I know we got better at but this is
but you can't do it because in fact
I don't know that I want you to say do better. I feel like that's
choose something else. We remember the first people who do something. Put your imagination to it. Don't just do what somebody. I'm trying to save kids' lives here.
Yeah, are you?
You might just be trying to kill someone else, right?
Yes, exactly, man. I don't really think that
save the kids.
Okay, but I really do want to a serious point though. I do want to say something. So I think that the point is really I think that the point is excellent, that this is the media has gotten better at how they talk about these things at not using the people's names, that there's less and less kind of thing, and this is all great. But I think that there's also what, Dan, like, I have to say, like, it feels as if like there is some type of, like, that it's not just the fact that people are extremist. It feels like they get to be heroes, even if it's just among, as they're remembered in their own small extremist communities. And whether or not we know their names, they think that like the people that matter most to them are going to know their names and know who they are.
And that's probably right. And in a way, that sort of thing is true for most of us, right? Which is we care tremendously, most of us, not about our kind of broad reputation, but our reputation among the people who we hang out with, right? It'd be very upsetting if our friends and colleagues thought poorly of us. And, in this kind of nasty little world, they have, people they would consider acquaintances and friends. And so I do think they get self-worth from it. And it's, it's deeply disturbing as a result. I mean, it's interesting to me, the kind of online shift in this, right? Because online bonds are usually not particularly strong, right? And so, there are some kind of, my wife sometimes says hearing me talk about terrorism is like having a golden doodle talk about terrorism, because I often emphasize the good part of what's happening in the world. So let me say one thing on the bright side, right, which is we've seen the decline of the skinhead movement. And that was an exceptionally violent movement. But it was low-key violence, right? These guys weren't going to a supermarket and shooting a bunch of people.
No,
they were getting drunk.
Me on the streets of Stockholm.
Yeah, they were getting drunk at a local pub and finding the first person who they thought they was right to beat up, right?
Yep.
And that could be a random person. It could be, often tended to be someone with darker skin. And so it's a lot of low-level violence. And the online shift actually really hurt this movement, right? So there could be good things about this as well, but appropriately we focus on the bad stuff. And unfortunately, there's a lot of bad stuff.
Do you think that the area that these, like, if we're talking about Twitch doing better at getting this down, why do you think that there does seem to be an interesting angle of this, which is that, is this happening more often, or are we hearing about it more often because of social media? So how do we know, like, whether or not there are more hate crimes happening or more white supremacist events happening, or whether or not someone is doing something like at a more extreme level or publicizing it more, or it's getting more take up by social media?
So, as we all know, the problem with the social media is that, any bias you have, any fear you have is confirmed because, there are 330 million Americans, right? So I can find proof of racism or anti-Semitism every second if I want. But again, I'm going to go to some good news before the bad news, right? So, 60, 70 years ago, right, in the United States, racism was encoded deeply in law and in social custom, right? So you didn't need a lot of violence if your goal was to make sure that minority communities were subordinate, if your goal was to prevent intermarriage, so you can go to courts, or at the very least, very strong social pressure. And, there were over 10,000 sundown towns in the United States where, Black Americans were not, were prohibited from entering after sundown, right? I mean, so like staggering levels of structural racism. The good news is, in my view at least, we've moved away from that pretty decisively. And we have a lot of low-level violence, and there it's extremely hard to tell because we don't collect data consistently. And some of the places we are least likely to collect data have the biggest problems. And, to go internationally for a minute, I talked to someone at an NGO in Poland, right? And he was talking me through this, and he was talking about how much, kind of violence and anti-Semitism and anti-Islamic sentiment is expressed in Poland. But he said, we don't really collect iron. In contrast, the UK, he said, does an excellent job collecting iron. So you could look at statistics and say, boy, the UK is horrible and Poland's great. If you're a Muslim, you should definitely go to Poland, not the UK, right? And that's just, disastrously wrong. And so this collection issue to me is a really big one. But the one thing that has certainly changed, and obviously for the worse, is we're seeing high-profile, mass casualty, white supremacist terrorism in a way that was less true in the past. And we saw a lot of violence and a lot of day-to-day violence and a lot of killing and a lot of lynching, right? But it wasn't the kind of mass shooting thing. And the Timothy McVeigh, in some ways marked a turning point, and there's one can call him anti-government, one can call him white supremacist. There's elements of both to what he did. But this is a real shift from violence in the past, which was much more kind of day-to-day violence and much less high-profile dramatic violence, which we're seeing much more recently.
Do you think that there is, there's a gun conversation here. There's a platform conversation here. And there is a how much do we care conversation here, both on the mass shooting side and on the white supremacy side. But is there low-hanging fruit that, you could implement as a policy matter and reduce the prevalence of these events?
So let me start by saying the last major white supremacist attack in the United States was in 2019. Right. So we've seen, you have to think of these attacks as kind of happening, I don't want to say randomly, but many have a chance of failure. And so we'll see some years where there are, multiple attacks and some years where there are zero.
Well,
So,
and just to use this as a pointed example of that, the New York Times is now reporting that he planned a second attack.
Right.
And so the first comes off, the second does not. I suppose you could say that's a policy success.
Yeah, it certainly could have been worse. Let's put it that way. As horrible as as the attacks were, and so it's always hard to tell, based on a single attack, are things getting worse, or are things getting better? But in terms of low hanging fruit, there are kind of basic things in gun laws to me about people with backgrounds that are investigated in terms of mental competence. One real question about this person was, going back to our school shooting discussion, was this person going to kill a bunch of people? He just needed some reason to do so. And it could have been, he had a job where he was going to hate his boss and go in and kill 5 people there. He was going to do it to an ex-girlfriend and her family, or he was going to do it to a school. And some of the people, the man who did the Pulse nightclub, Omar Mateen, for example, were that kind of person, right? They were looking around for a cause that was associated with violence, as opposed to some people who are
to them kind of randomly.
Exactly. So, it's hard to say how much of this guy, we wouldn't call it terrorism if he shot up his boss, right? But you still would have innocent people dead. And so I don't want to attach too much to this particular example. So I would say, one is on gun laws. Kate's done a lot more work on the social media side, and I do think they've made progress, right? Like, I really want to stress this. But it shows you kind of, what a boulder they're pushing up when it comes to pushing stuff uphill, right? Because if they made progress and it didn't work in this case, what does that say? So to me, that's something where I used to be more optimistic. And now I'm like, well, okay, they're actually doing some of what I told them. Not that they listened, but some of what people were suggesting. And, lo and behold, a big thing to me is political rhetoric, right? And to me, this is, I feel both naive saying this and yet crazy not to, which is, wouldn't it be nice if politicians drew bright lines between, political discourse and support for violence? And I never thought that was a particularly controversial point. And I would have said 25 years ago, there are politicians I disagree with, but I don't think they're supporting violence. And now I get really upset when I look at people who are serious politicians saying things that are to me clearly in the border of incitement.
So why is it, well, maybe this is more of a, maybe I know the answer to this, but I'll ask it. It's like, why is it that we're like, why, when we search for blame, and this is something that I've written a bit about, which is like kind of a cognitive science concept. When we search for blame, we go back and we try to figure out what can we do to remedy this again, to try to stop this from happening again, right? And it's a very hopeless concept if people can't find somewhere to lay the blame. And typically they like to lay the blame at the largest and most kind of well-funded types of entities, which is one of the reasons I think platforms typically kind of get saddled with this right now. And the government maybe would have been saddled with this before the platforms. But I think that your point is a great one, like, which is like, why are politicians not getting blamed for this? And like, I will go one step further. I would say that like, not only are they using violent rhetoric and not drawing a straight, like a bright line between like rhetoric and actual calls for incitement to violence, but I would say that they're also in the waste of time that they're spending on stupid rhetoric around really like, just like, I guess I'm just very frustrated around a lot of the stuff that I guess that I'm seeing from politicians lately, in which there's just a lot of bloviating. They're never going to pass laws. They're never going to do anything. And there's just all of this wasted time that there's actual things that need to kind of happen, like conversations about gun control and things like that. And we're not having the conversations because no one wants to touch that, depending on their district. And I don't know. I think that that's terrible.
Some of this audience may have read the Peter Baker biography of James Baker, and I have some criticisms of that book. But one thing that he points out was, in Washington, 30 years ago, your mark was made by taking on tough problems. Right? You took on tough problems and you made progress on them, and people pointed to you and admired you. Right, and now it seems to be by taking out rhetorically pure and ideologically pure stands that have no kind of relevance to actual governing or legislation. And if you do something, God forbid you say, hey, let's do immigration reform, and I'll make some compromises and you make some compromises, and some of our supporters won't be happy with those compromises, but overall it'll be better. Then you're just hated by everyone and has no chance of success, right? And I don't quite know what led to that shift, where people don't want their government to get things done and admired probably should use air quotes here, but admired the principled stance over actual accomplishment.
So what we have,
sorry, I just like, that's a great James Baker, I forgot about that, but yeah, thank you.
The gun element is not novel in the sense that this is not new technology. The ability we had a relatively brief period where we had where we had assault weapons ban, but it was pretty brief. Mass shootings have happened at least since the Texas Tower murders in the late 60s or early 70s. And there's definitely an accelerant effect associated with Columbine and the internet and people discussing it. It didn't used to be merged with white supremacy the way it is now. And there's a kind of merger of the mass shooting phenomenon, which used to just be angry guy, really pissed off. The phrase we used for it was going postal. And it didn't seem to have a political valence other than really pissed off. Now it's Pulse, which is anti-gay, Charleston, which is anti-black, Tree of Life is anti-Jewish, El Paso is anti-Hispanic, and this
Christchurch is anti-Muslim.
Christchurch is anti-Muslim. This is anti-black. It really does seem like the mass shooting phenomenon, which the normal old just kill students thing still happens at Virginia Tech and what's it called in Florida. That still happens, but there does seem to be, and Las Vegas, which is the biggest of all, there does seem to be, at least in some subcategory of these mass shootings, a merger with the white supremacist movement. What do we know about how that happened? Or is the N so small that we really shouldn't say that it has happened? All we can say is that there's been several of them.
It's definitely happened, and let me point to two things that I think are key. One is, as this movement moved away from being tied to government and part of legitimate society, it became incredibly decentralized and disorganized. And so, one thing to think about is there aren't really large or significant violent white supremacist groups in the United States and in many other countries, right? We can talk about individual figures, we can talk about networks, we can talk about movements like the Boogaloo, but if you say there's no Al Qaeda or ISIS type things, in contrast to 40, 50 years ago, we could talk about clan chapters that were hierarchical and organized and had thousands of members, and part of that was social pressure. And a lot of it was an extremely effective and rather ruthless FBI campaign that just shattered these organizations, and made it very expensive, in part due to civil lawsuits, to be a member of them if someone did any violence. So you have legal and government pressure and social pressure that weakens groups, and that means kind of anyone can say what the movement's about, right? I think the Nazi movement today is about chasing poodles in the park, right? And that's as in effective opinion as someone else's, right? There's no one who can say here's what our movement believes, here's what our members believe. And the internet, of course, has put this all on steroids. Just as it's, if you will, democratized politics, right? Where you have people who you're like, why does that person have any authority to comment on politics, right? They're just, someone kind of writing from their basement. Nevertheless, they have a million followers. That, of course, has happened in the white supremacist hate space. So you have a lot of competition in this broader fringe space. And so you see every possible combination, right? It's almost a kind of bell-shaped curve where you see, some people who are tied to, very strong anti-feminism, linking up with anti-government extremism. A Lawfare, there was a piece about the Unabomber making a comeback among right-wing extremists, right? There are all these kind of bizarre combinations, and it's in part because there are no regulators, right? There are no groups to organize things, and social media allows anyone to put up whatever they want. So it's tremendous competition, and everyone's always trying to kind of grab on allies and bring in new people. And in a way, this is a strength of the movement, right? It's incredibly dynamic and it focuses on new things, but it's also a weakness, right? They can't actually get much done, right? They're not able to do, going back to, boy, they've really hit everyone in the last 5 years, right? The flip side is, yeah, but it hasn't been, a sustained campaign against one particular group that has fundamentally shaped that group, right? It's been, very diffuse, and as a result, had less strategic impact, even though it's scary to lots of different people.
Yeah, but it is scary to lots of different people. And to your point, which I think is one of the points that you make so well in the book, like you can have racists in Poland and South Africa and New Zealand and Kansas and Buffalo, New York, and you can have them all find each other and all feel like they're not alone, and all kind of be cheering each other on in these various ways. And it doesn't. And I kind of made this point, and I think I was being very inarticulate when I was trying to make it the last time you were on, but I was like, what is the unifying part of all of these various people if they're hating on, is it just the white supremacy? Does white supremacy mean that they can hate on everyone? And that is the unifying thing that kind of draws them together in their hate?
Well, but I think there's something else going on here. So I've made this point before on this show, which is that when you put something together like in lieu of fun, you get, how many people are on Crowdcast right now, KK?
128.
128 people, and it's really nice, but it doesn't scale. And if you get 128 people together and you tell them, how much today is we hate Jews and tomorrow is we hate black people and Thursday is anti-gay day, and that's going to excite a lot of people, and you really do that scales. And I think part of the problem that I've never figured out is why the hate stuff scales so well. And the I think the reason for it is, if you're the Stormfront people and you're publishing a physical newspaper and you have to pass it out on the street, it's pretty socially unacceptable to take it. And then to say, hey, wow, this Stormfront shit, I love this. Think I'm going to copy it myself and pass it out myself. That's pretty socially unacceptable. But if you come to Washington and you sit in your own room at the Brookings Institution and you get together with all the people around the world who love Stormfront in lieu of fun Stormfront, it's suddenly socially acceptable to do that. And you can pass stuff around, you can do all kinds of things. And I think the nature of it enables the transmission in a way that's really hard to do in meat space because 95% of people disapprove of what you're doing.
Well, what you're basically saying is you're actually making an argument that they scale down their movement, build their own community in which their norms are different.
Yeah,
And so
when they
there's
go
no
into the chat
right.
room, they type norms.
But what I'm trying to say is kind of like what I guess I'm saying is that they're not negatively defining themselves. Does this make sense, Dan? They're not defining themselves as being against something. They're defining themselves as being for white supremacy. And therefore, like basically that actually that gives them like more of a unifying structure than being against something in like the is that is that making a little any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And having said, look, we shouldn't invest too much in the great replacement theory because the ideas are old. One thing that is, I think, very powerful about it is white supremacists have used it to unify lots of very different causes, right? So it's, immigrants are coming was kind of the beginning of this to replace us, right? And that's still extremely common theme. But it's also, Black people are having more babies to replace us. It's liberals are encouraging homosexuality so white women don't have babies so we can be replaced. Liberals want abortion so white women don't have children
And
we can be
Jews are
replaced.
bringing all those people
And
here.
Jews are behind it all
And
as our
Jews
government
are eating the white babies.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of an endless and rather grim set of teachings, but they all can kind of come together. And the more eloquent among them would talk about defense of their people and defense of the white race, and that I do think resonates among lots of people who are looking at, they would say, look, this is not the America I grew up in. And that's actually a true statement. And in some ways, that's actually a very good thing, right? The America that I grew up in had some real faults, and we've moved in a positive direction in some ways. But they're also looking at what they feel are the negatives, especially if you're a white male and you're seeing a very different world.
Yeah. So there's a great question from Bonnie in the audience, and she can't come on, so I'm going to read it for her. But I think this is like a nice kind of segue into audience questions, which is, what is the best way to identify these groups in your own local area? Is doxing and then secondarily, which I think these are two very different questions, but then is doxing to their employers an effective curb? And I mean, I can answer what I think the answer to the doxing question is, which is like no, hard no. But I don't know. What do you think, Dan?
So if you look at something like the Anti-Defamation League or the Southern Poverty Law Center, they'll have whole databases of symbols that people use. And you'll see them, once you become sensitized to this, you'll see people flying these flags, or you'll see bumper stickers, you'll see tattoos, you'll see lots of things that make it not always obvious, but at times people are wearing their colors. And from their point of view, it's almost a secret code, right? It's like, one Harry Potter fan recognizing another by wearing Gryffindor colors, right? But it's, a much darker version of that. And you can be part of that. I'm with Kate. I just don't like vigilantism of any sort.
It's not just vigilantism. It's like Hobbesian, right? Like you just go down, like it's like if you meet violence with violence, you will just get more violence, and it'll just it's just a terrible, right?
The only thing I would say on doxing is I do feel if you find that there's a member of law enforcement or someone with very significant public responsibilities who has those links, kind of reporting it privately to an employer is appropriate.
Yeah, I want to say a couple words in defense of doxing. Not because I'm in favor of it in general, but because I think the circumstances matter. Um, when the newspapers do it, we call it reporting. Um, and um, and there have been a lot of things that have been found out about the, you know, which we call news, uh, by news organizations getting certain documents in which people are doing inappropriate things and reporting them. And so my bottom line here is it really matters how you're doing it, whether you're quality controlling it, and whether the target is a big enough fish to warrant wrecking the person's life. And I do think the standard that Dan just articulated, which is that person exercising control over other people using the power of the state, I think is a legitimate one. But let me give you another one that I think is legit, that involves a colleague of Dan's, Christine Fair, who discovered one day that Richard Spencer, the prominent Nazi, was a member of her gym, and she went. I think a fair word for it is bananas on the subject on Twitter, and got him expelled from the gym. And I don't really have a deep problem with that myself. Um, and I thought Christine, she handled it with her usual calm, even tempered demeanor. But I don't really see why, people who work in that gym who may be minorities or people of color or any of a number of others should have to work in an environment in which they're subjected to Richard Spencer and his whatever he feels like saying on a particular day. So I think the question of doxing is honestly depends very much on circumstances, and it's like super easy to take a position of principle about it, but then when you immediately end up in the situation Dan was just in, which is like, well, except when they're law enforcement, and then you would have to add to it, or I would, except when they're Richard Spencer, when it's okay. And I do think you end up in a kind of totality of the circumstances kind of test.
I mean, I agree with that, but I think yes, but this is why I think that basically you have to, if you're going to have a bright line rule and not a totality of the circumstances test, which is obviously not administrable at the scale that we're talking about, then I think that the rule has to be no doxing. So to your point about so just the other day,
but no doxing not applied to journalists.
Well, that I was just about to bring this up because the Washington Free Beacon just yesterday, or 2 days ago, which is ostensibly a newspaper or something, just doxed, had a bunch of leaked private Instagram posts that a bunch of women in law schools had posted at Yale Law School had posted in their private thing. And apparently somebody that was they had allowed to follow them had screenshotted them and leaked it to a journalist, and the journalists had published these Yale Law School. I mean, maybe they're going to be future senators or something. And so they're getting ahead of it by stopping these abortionists from getting into positions of power. But my point is how do you draw those lines?
Well, what I would say is a law student is not fair game, as a general matter. Now,
you know who was a law student once? J.D. Vance. I don't know. I just feel it's
J.D. Vance today, his activity as a law student is totally fine. It's totally fair game. But when he was a law student, he was a law student.
What about Tiffany Trump when she was a law student just a couple of years ago?
Totally not fair game, I think.
Even when she was the daughter of the president of the United States while she was a law student?
You know what? I think you get to she didn't choose that. And I think probably a lot of people didn't report stuff about Tiffany Trump that, not that I know of anything that, but I, look, if she was a law student at Georgetown, if you had paparazzi'd her, I'm sure there were things that you could have been an asshole and found out. I'm not saying that with any knowledge. I'm just that's the nature of what that kind of like life is, right? Somebody could go to every party she was at and snap pictures. It's an asshole thing to do. There's no legitimate public interest in that. On the other hand, if you're a law student who's about to go clerk for a appellate court judge of prominence and you have a history of white supremacy, I think that is a legitimate matter of news. That Kate Klonick, who's about to go clerk on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, her judge accepted her as a clerk, knowing that she had this history of posting white supremacist stuff. This is all, I'm making it all up, but like, I think that's a legitimate story, and the judge should be answerable for it, and the individual should be answerable for it.
Dan?
So I've kind of wrestled with this question in one of my classes. We wrestle with this a lot. I tend to be very cautious of this because I think it can easily become here's people I don't like, let's screw them. And it's so easy to slip into that. So to Ben's point on journalism, I would say, yes, but the whole point is I can't just say to the Washington Post, Ben Whittis is a child molester, print it. And some reporter is going to run with it, right? They would verify it. They would check out different sources. And the whole point of a reputable journalist is they do that, right? And so I think the journalist craft, if you will, the whole point is that it's not simply hitting forward on any email they receive, right? And that to me is quite different than doxing. And the problem with doxing is I'm sure there are individual doxers who actually have legitimate code of ethics. But there's just no way to verify that. There's no way to hold them accountable the way we can say, I'm not going to read the Washington Post because it doesn't have a code of ethics. The way there are some places, frankly, I don't read because I feel they don't uphold reportorial standards. And then on the public interest point, I would agree, actually. Usually, though, again, I would favor leaking it to a journalist, having him or her kind of vet the information and collate it and have more reach. But there is a question of at what point does this become immediately in the broader public interest? And I would have that be pretty high in terms of, what sort of person that would be. But I actually, having said that, I do include local police officers just because, that person has tremendous discretion in terms of what to investigate and how to treat local people. And, the last thing we want is to have our system of justice called into question. So on the political side and the social kind of stature side, I tend to want someone fairly high up before we even think about these issues. But on the law enforcement side, I'm willing to go much lower. But even then, I would be much more inclined to simply have the person write to their boss rather than splash it over the newspaper.
Yeah. I mean, to Ben's point about public interest, I just think that that's a slippery slope. Like 50% of the country doesn't believe in abortion. And so right now, if we just tip into a world in which being pro-choice becomes a matter of public interest, then there's a lot of people who become hazard for doxing and whatever. But that being said, I am trying. I swear to God, I'm not Alicing Alice. Alice, I cannot unmute your video or unmute. There you are. Hi. Okay.
Can you unmute yourself, Alice?
Oh shit.
Oh, so
okay.
so expel Alice and then bring her back.
Bring you back. Okay. And Richard, hopefully I can bring. I also can't bring on Richard. What's going on? Richard.
See, this is what happens when I don't captain the show.
That's not true.
No, it's really not.
But there's this happens all the time. Let me just try to bring in Alice again, but maybe, and in the meantime, I'm gonna have to dismiss Richard and bring him back. But hopefully this works and we can get Alice back on. Oh, there's Alice. No, God damn it. Oh my God. Why?
Okay, Alice, here's what you're gonna do. Go up to the top of your screen and click your mic button.
Richard is unmuted now. So Richard, talk.
So click your sound settings and it'll throw you out and bring you back in.
I want someone to do it in semaphore. That's just always been my dream. But
yeah, I know. Richard, we can't see you, but we can hear you. So go ahead and ask your question.
So you can hear this.
We
Yes.
can.
Hello? Oh, good. Okay. So are there efforts that you know of to internationalize white supremacy, that is, to forge a sense of solidarity among white supremacists throughout the world? And I'm thinking about something along the lines of Bannon's efforts to forge a global or European coalition of reactionaries.
So definitely, and David Duke was a very popular speaker in a number of countries in kind of what we used to call Eastern Europe and also Russia. And so we do see individuals who have been trying to do this. In Europe, being Europe, you see a lot of individuals crossing borders. And you definitely see, often this is in the English speaking world, individuals who are, they would redefine themselves as not as Americans, but as whites, right? So in their view, they have a transnational identity of white civilization and white blood. And therefore, when a white is attacked in Canada or white is attacked in Australia, they feel it's an attack on their community, even if it's in a different country. So we definitely see individuals doing this. And then you see, kind of trollish countries like Russia have tried to play this up. And often, we've seen Russian media treat David Duke as like an actual voice of something, right? As if this was a person you get a legitimate comment on. So, yes, the movement certainly wants to do this. The problem, again, though, is it's a very divided movement. So some individuals are doing it to gain prominence, but it's not as if there's a broad, coherent organization that is selectively putting forth people and pushing them, pushing out their ideas.
Yeah.
All right.
Go ahead, Ben.
Oh, sorry. No. You go ahead. I'm
I
just
don't
waiting
think
for Alice to come back.
I don't know if she's gonna come back, but we will see. I'm gonna close this out. I'm gonna read her questions because they're both good and they both got a lot of upvotes. And I'm gonna bring on Mateo to ask the last question. Alice asked, and this is kind of similar to Richard's point. Do the groups that you cover in your book agree on the definition of whiteness? Is her first question. And I'm super interested in that as well. And then how much has been done at the federal level? It seems like the Biden administration is interested in prosecuting hate crimes, but that is far from a guarantee. So interested in your thoughts on that, Dan.
Sure. So in terms of what whiteness is, again, I would stress the weakness of the groups themselves, right? So there's no one who can enforce borders. And, if you look, not to go too far back in history, right, but it used to be a lot of what these white supremacist groups really railed against were white Catholics coming from countries like Italy, right? And so,
Germany.
And Germany, right, these are now
right?
white people.
The anti-beer laws were all about anti-German sentiment in Ohio.
And we do see kind of, Protestant attacks on Catholic areas in a number of in the Pennsylvania area, for example, in Ohio area. And so who whites are has grown. And and it encouraged, the kind of Catholic Protestant divide has been transcended as just one very important example. But that was, throughout US history and in other countries, that mattered a lot. But again, I would just stress no one agrees because there's no one who can enforce borders. Right. A few things I would say, though, obviously blacks are out. Latinos are out, but there's kind of the eternal question of how many generations that lasts. Jews are never white, no matter where they're from. And so there are some people who are always on the outs, but where to draw the lines is a question mark. Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, I just want to add to this. I think there are a few definitional parameters that Dan just alluded to. So the original conception of whiteness was really about white Protestant Scot
Anglo-Saxon.
But not Irish, right? So
that's because Anglo-Saxon Protestant, yeah.
And then it included Scandinavian non-Catholics and some German non-Catholics, but not German Catholics, right? And so the original Ohio problem was Bavarians who showed up and had very different cultural milieus. Then it became an anti-Southern European thing, Italians, Greeks, and importantly, Eastern Europeans, anti-Polish, anti-Russian, Czech. Um, uh, Eventually, this all rounds to zero. And I think at the end, even the anti-Latino thing, Nick Fuentes, right, is his last
Right.
name is Fuentes.
Enrique Cario, right? I mean,
Right, like um, you know, the 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 Latino Hispanic relationship here is, I think, really about how dark the skin of the Hispanic is, right? And whether they're um you know um
Whether they're
eventually
Spanish or like Mexican indigenous and like that kind of thing. Right. No, I think that
exactly
that's right.
eventually there's two bright red lines, which is black and dark people and Jews, and they're for very different reasons. Um, but they're the immutable ones whose whiteness, at least for the white supremacists, if not for the society, because Jewish acceptance in society is radically different than it was 70 years ago. But you know, like 70 years ago, Italians weren't white, and now they are. And that is, for the white supremacists, that change doesn't happen with there's no change that happens with blacks and Jews and with people whose skin is quite dark.
Mateo, great to see you.
Good to see you. I had two questions. Do you have a preference?
I think just you're the one that's top voted up.
All right. So my question is whether the two separate goals you guys were talking a little bit more in the beginning of mitigating the spread of just hateful belief systems amongst the population, distinct from the goal of preventing radicalization amongst people who actually might do violence. I'm wondering if those two goals are compatible, and incompatible in terms of what policies one might pursue in order to follow them. I'm thinking about this in particular in terms of like platform policy, but as a general matter, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
Let me start, but I'd like Kate to have the last word on this. So when we talk about a relatively small number of violent individuals, that can be, a front and center law enforcement task. They can be identified, dangerous ones can be monitored, and if they're, going towards illegal behavior, there can be arrests, right? And sometimes it can be an actual arrest with criminal charges. Sometimes it could be a knock on the door saying, hey, just so you know, we've been seeing some disturbing stuff and maybe you want to stop it, right? And that can go a long way, and that discretion, I think, is very important. When you get to the broader societal issues, one, I'm not sure I have any good ideas, right? I've given a few thoughts in this hour, but it's just a mess. And, calling for politicians to be more responsible, calling for people not to, gain followers and make money when they're clearly gaining followers and making money by sowing hate, isn't actually, to me, that realistic a recommendation, as much as I would like to see people be more responsible. It's a little like, telling teenagers, don't go out partying and drinking because it's dangerous, right? It's a true statement, but not going to get you very far. And so I do see that these are very different problems, but they overlap because the actions of kind of the broader community, not necessarily the majority, but even the broader community, have a big impact on the fringe. And that's really important as we're trying to solve this problem.
We are going to leave it there. Dan Byman,
Yeah.
You're a Great American. Kate,
This is the book.
yeah,
Spreading Hate, the Global Rise of White Supremacist Terrorism. Look for it tomorrow on the Today Show.
so
Behind my face.
this is complicated, people, but don't spread hate, but do spreading hate. Okay?
Good work.
That's
Good
a
work,
subtle
Ben.
one. I'm pretty sure most of you can get it, I'm sure it's going to be taken out of context on Twitter by somebody, and I'm looking forward to that. We will be back Wednesday. It's going to be an awesome day, people, because we are playing Where's the Lie with Mateo, who was nominated by Paula as the next contestant on Audience Where's the Lie. That'll be 46 hours and 59 minutes from now. And until then, Dan Byman.
Thank you, everyone. It's been great.
All right.
Bye.